is the Nature Conservancy's Western Kansas Conservation Manager. In addition to overseeing all of our operations on an 18,000 acre ranch called Smoky Valley Ranch and the relatively new Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park, Matt works with landowners and ranchers in the area to conserve the remaining prairie out there. And he is an expert at that. Matt is also involved in the development and implementation of several programs that benefit both landowners and wildlife, including the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative. He's also a member of the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative science team. He's responsible for launching, by the way, he and Laura Rose Clausen, who, by the way, before I go any further, I want to thank Laura Rose Clausen, who put this together. She has worked tirelessly to make all of this happen logistically. So all 200 and some of you who are on this call, we owe thanks to Laura for that. So thank you, Laura. Laura is the Director of Outreach and Communications for the Nature Conservancy in Kansas. Back to Matt. Here's an interesting factoid about Matt Bain. He did the graduate research that discovered the hybridization, or at least he's credited with it, hybridization between lesser prairie chicken and greater chicken. And he continues to focus his work and his research very much on lesser chickens and other species of the shortgrass prairie. I had the pleasure of working with Matt at the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks years ago, and Matt's been with the Nature Conservancy since 2012. So thanks for being here, Matt. We also have Tish McDaniel with us, who, by the way, has been going to lesser prairie chicken booming grounds since she was 9 months old. Reportedly, she took her first trip there in a shoebox. I'm not sure I buy that, but that's the legend around Tish. And she's still going to lesser prairie chicken leks on a regular basis. She spent more than 25 years as an environmental educator, as a grassland ecologist. She's been a huge mentor to young conservationists, particularly young women. Tish has been outstanding. She worked for the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico for about a decade, and she's been instrumental in a lot of the field conservation initiatives that have benefited lesser prairie chickens, including the establishment of the Millen Sand Prairie Preserve in New Mexico. She was also with the Center of Excellence in New Mexico as a project director at Millen Sand, and this is an important one to me as a longtime grouse aficionado and a member of the North American Grouse Partnership Board of Directors. Tish was only the second woman to be awarded the Hammerstrom Award, which is, if you're not a grouse biologist or a grouse enthusiast, it might not mean anything to you, but it is the most prestigious award that a grouse biologist can receive. And Tish was just the second woman to receive that. We were really proud of her for that. Also want to introduce to you Chris O'Melia. I've known Chris since his days with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in Tulsa some 15, 20 years ago. He's with the Ecological Field Services Office with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now in Manhattan, Kansas. He's been with them 19 years, including those 9 years in Oklahoma, and his current year role in Kansas. Chris grew up in rural Oklahoma near Cashin. He worked for family farmers in the area, has a good rural background. He understands agriculture. He's also an excellent prairie ecologist and a great champion of lesser prairie chicken. Chris is really good at collaborating with private landowners. He's also really good at decoding federal laws and bureaucracy like the Endangered Species Act and helping people navigate through them to get the outcome they want on their farm, ranch, or business. Chris is a great supporter of conservation of wildlife and native habitats all over the Great Plains, and it's been my privilege to be one of his colleagues for a long time. Lastly, Betty Williamson, I've only met briefly. She probably doesn't remember it, but I met Betty Williamson when I was in New Mexico a while back. She's a rancher in southeastern New Mexico, in a place that was homesteaded by her grandparents 106 years ago or so, well over a century ago. Reportedly because their wagon became mired in the sand and they couldn't go any further, so they just decided to set up camp there and establish a ranch there, and they must have been successful because they've survived there for over 100 years. Betty spends a lot of time in nature. She writes about nature, and particularly in the high plains. She's a widely recognized freelance writer. She writes a weekly column for the newspaper there. And Tish and Betty were the co-coordinators of the High Plains Lesser Prairie Chicken Festival in New Mexico. And she's going to tell you a little bit more about that later. Uh, she's cooked breakfast for more people than she can count after they stagger in starving from an early morning grueling encounter with lesser prairie chicken on the lek. She's also one of the first people to have handcrafted a human size, I can hardly even envision this, lesser prairie chicken costume. And I'm pretty sure there's a dance that goes with that costume. Maybe we'll get to see that later. She spent a lifetime honing her procrastination skills, she says, and is dedicated to preserving her ongoing attitude of unwarranted optimism. And I will guarantee you that you'll enjoy Betty's comments. They're both accurate and colorful. So with that, we'll begin this. And I want to give Matt Bain a chance to kick us off here and just talk a little bit in general about lesser prairie chickens, their special place on our planet and in our hearts. And Matt, I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Rob. Can we see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks again to everybody for taking the time to tune in this evening. I'm just going to start off with a few basics of prairie chickens. Lesser and greater prairie chicken are two very closely related species. The lesser is about 30% smaller on average, and it has thinner, lighter bars, smaller, redder air sacs, and they have a disproportionately longer pinnae. That's the ear-like feathers. But the primary difference is their booming vocalization. So we'll see if it works here. So that's the lesser prairie chicken, highly stereotyped boom. And that's the greater prairie chicken, a very striking difference. So the prairie chickens are ground nesting birds, basically prairie obligate nesting birds. And this means that their habitat has to consist of tall vegetation that's basically left over from the previous year's growth. So during mating season, especially, males and females both have a very high risk of predation. Males are exposed on the leks and hens are vulnerable while they're nesting. But the real survival challenge is for the chicks. And it's really kind of amazing that there's only about a 50% chance that a single egg in a nest of 10 to 12 eggs will survive to hatching, and only about a 10 to 20% chance that a single chick in that nest will survive to adulthood. Once they do reach adulthood, they have about a 35% chance of surviving in a given year and a maximum observed lifespan of 5 years. They also have a really unique mating system called a lek mating system. The lek depicted here is comprised of hundreds of point locations of individual males. The dark points are a single bird's territory called a court. Each male defends and displays in that court, trying to be chosen by an attending female. On an average lek, there's about 10 males, so 10 of these courts, and only 1 to 2 of those males will do about 100% of the mating. So imagine, if you're one of the other 8 or 9 males, that's thousands of hours of extremely high energy costs, exposure to predation, and basically no chance of mating. So it really is a peculiar mating system. Here you can see the estimated historic range in light green with a significant distribution in 5 states, and the current range in dark green. Their current range is divided into somewhat distinct ecoregions. This includes the shortgrass and CRP ecoregion in the northern portion of the range, the mixed grass prairie here to the south, the Shinnery Oak Prairie, in eastern New Mexico and West Texas, and finally the sand sage prairie in southwest Kansas and eastern Colorado. And you can see that in terms of vegetative structure, all these habitats have quite a bit of similarity, even though they're in very wide-ranging areas. So that's about what I got for now, Rob, on
All right.
background.
Thank you, Matt.
Bet.
We're going to learn some more about this special bird, the technical side and the legal side, but I'd like, Betty, if you would you just talk about the emotion, the awareness, the iconic importance of lesser prairie chickens with a twist from your part of New Mexico?
Sure, I'd be glad to. And I've got prepared remarks because I'm not a good off-the-cuff speaker. So the better part of a century ago, before ecotourism was a word or even a concept, my father used to invite his friends out to the sand hills here in Roosevelt County, New Mexico, in the pre-dawn of spring mornings to witness something he treasured all of his life, the mating ritual of the prairie chickens. The invitation included a chauffeur, my dad, a tour guide, my dad, a self-taught naturalist, my dad, and a cook in a battered black felt cowboy hat, my dad. After the morning adventuring, our visitors feasted on eggs and bacon cooked over a mesquite-fed campfire, washed down with coffee so thick you could stand a spoon up in it. We didn't know or use the word lek back then. We called it a booming ground. Our favorite one was and still is about a mile southeast of our house, not too far from where my grandparents built the homestead shack in 1915. Even after 59 springs for me here on the high plains, it is still a thrill to be there as the stars fade, the barest glow lights up the eastern sky, and the hushed and sacred silence is broken by the sound of wings as the first birds coast in to stake out territories and begin their joyous, raucous ritual. Now, some of you may be familiar with the High Plains Prairie Chicken Festival that we had for 11 years in Melanson starting in 2002. Possibly some of you attended. My dad was 90 the first year that we had one, but I like to think that his early love and enthusiasm for this really special bird might have been a factor in making that event a success. Our festival happened over a 3-day period each April. Attendees were taken lakeside to witness the chickens on 2 different mornings. We called it sanctioned voyeurism. Our visitors also got to choose from a slew of field trips and seminars aimed to celebrate the unique flora and fauna of our corner of the High Plains. Not to mention guest speakers and live music and great home cooked. Our nonprofits and federal and state agencies involved is the keyword for this festival. There aren't too many of us who live in this vast and loosely defined mill and sand community. I found something online that says 35, and I don't really know what they counted to get to that number. But this festival never would have succeeded without the community which embraced it. Grilling burgers, flipping pancakes, emptying trash cans, giving directions, sweeping floors, filling ice chests, and best of all, offering giant-hearted hospitality to the 100 visitors who came each year from as far away as Canada. Yes, the festival was a fundraiser for our volunteer fire department, and yes, it helped pay the year-round maintenance bills for our community building, but it also was an awareness raiser for both visitors and locals. Our attendees got front row seats on one of the best springtime shows in the bird world, and they got to learn from those of us who live here how challenging it is to make a living in this harsh environment. In turn, local ranchers and landowners found out that those tree-hugging bird watchers were really fascinating folks who became lifelong friends. It enriched us all in ways that cannot be measured in dollars. Besides the festivals, the Melanson community also played host for numerous educational events designed to showcase our bird. We've welcomed students from Eastern New Mexico University's Wildlife Club, honors classes from Texas Tech University, and alternative spring breakers from the University of Missouri, to name a few. Workshops have been offered for groups ranging from public school children to rural electric linemen. The writer David McCullough gets credit for some very important words that apply well to the less familiar critters on our planet. You can't love what you don't know very much about. I'll close with these two statements. Number one, the majority of people have never even seen a lesser prairie chicken. And number two, I've never met anyone who didn't fall madly in love with them once they did.
Thank you, Betty. Fantastic. You can see why she's a successful freelance writer. Well, the lesser prairie chicken, its biology, its ecology, its habitat are all things that are in a bit of trouble. And I'd like for Tish McDaniel to tell us a little bit about efforts to conserve this species and its population and decline of its habitat. Tish?
Thank you, Rob. And I too have prepared remarks. And Kansas, thank you for inviting New Mexico to be part of this. We're only given 4 minutes to kind of give our little lecture here. And so I cannot cover adequately what has happened and how we got to where we are. The habitat across the 5-state range, 4 ecoregions for lesser prairie chicken may look quite different to the untrained, but lessers across the occupied range have the same habitat requirements for their core areas. Sandy soil with room for expansion and colonization during periods of improved environmental conditions. That's called rain. Greater than 60% grassland for a population to maintain, and 80 to 95% grassland to persist through a severe drought, and large areas of unfragmented land with minimal vertical structures, no trees. Lessers are a grassland bird like Matt referenced, thus they avoid vertical structures. These birds are not migratory. Therefore, the habitat must have patch types to meet all their life history requirements for nesting, brooding, loafing, and surviving the cold and heat. Without those basic needs, the bird fails. We must be careful in determining what the population should be and what it once was. Historic numbers are misleading due to the boom and bust cycles and the onset of croplands serving as temporary food plots for the lessers starting in the early 1900s. It has been suggested wisely to not look at numbers prior to 1960 as they are probably inflated. We should also question the numbers that have been set as goals for each ecoregion also. By the late 1900s, only 10 to 15% of the historical range remained occupied. In the 4 ecoregions and occupied range, the lesser prairie chicken declined in the late 1980s to the mid 1990s. The trend then increased in 2008 and then declined again by half in 2012. Population began an upward trend then in 2015 to 2020. Note the cyclical nature of this grouse species. LEC surveys in Shinnery Oak ecoregion for 2021, that's down in the New Mexico, West Texas, are showing approximately a 20% decline as this area is in long-term drought pattern. Lessers respond positively to moisture as precipitation produces grass, cover, seeds, forbs, and insects. The human-caused actions that have led to decline in number are many. Fragmentation. Imagine a jigsaw puzzle totally torn apart. That's what fragmentation is. Large blocks of habitat have been broken up by roads, power lines, wind turbines, oil and gas development, all which ultimately lead to loss of habitat. Other human-caused actions leading to decline in numbers are degradation of habitat, unmanaged domestic livestock grazing, suppression of fire, conversion of prairie to cropland, loss of acres enrolled in the USDA Farm Bill Conservation Reserve Program, better known as CRP. CRP is a program that pays producers, usually for a span of 10 years, to discontinue farming in highly erodible soils, prairie chicken habitat, and put it into grass. Grazing is restricted. Invasion, another cause for decline in the prairie chicken numbers is the invasion of shrubs, mesquite, and trees, cedar, juniper. depletion of surface water, energy exploration and development, oil and gas, transmission lines, and wind farms. There are drivers that are also out of our control, and they are huge: drought and climate change. In New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado, populations are isolated with less genetic diversity due to the above stated conditions. In the 2020 range-wide report by WAFWA, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the populations of the 4 ecoregions was estimated at 34,408. Broken down into ecoregions, the estimated population was the Sand Sage Prairie region, 171 birds, the Shinnery Oak, 5,139, mixed grass, 4,754, the short grass CRP mosaic, 24,345. Now, kind of an interesting side to all of this that came from a researcher is there are confounding facts now that are really hard to ignore and need more research and thought. Researchers and resource managers ask, what has changed since the 1980s when numbers were high in Shinnery Oak and Sand Sagebrush? There have been no documented large-scale landscape changes in these historical ranges or ecosystem. The shortgrass ecoregion is now carrying the majority of the population. Why? It does not offer the proper amount of vegetation or structure. Why? Climate change, better quality CRP in the northern region, or are we missing a small grasshopper somewhere? Thank you.
Thank you, Tish. It's fantastic. Chris O'Melia, I introduced earlier, is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And the federal regulations and the process that go around protecting a species like the lesser prairie chicken are complicated. But I've listened to Chris explain this stuff many times before, and I'm going to ask him to do it again. Talk to us about the ESA and the listing process for a bird like the lesser prairie chicken, Chris.
Yeah, you bet, Rob. Thank you for the opportunity. So, I thought I would start with kind of framing the service mission so that folks understand where we are and the kind of the diverse roles our agency covers. So the mission statement is literally to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. The different roles and programs within the Fish and Wildlife Service, there are many things outside of the Endangered Species Act that contribute to conservation through our agency. My role in ecological services is to deal with those kinds of things that are at-risk species or listed species under the Endangered Species Act. So I view my role as one piece in the conservation world for lesser prairie chickens, and especially grassland conservation, because the chicken is just one component of that. And one opportunity for me to engage in grassland conservation is through conservation of prairie chickens. So all of those partnerships and relationships we have are important to this, and they serve their own role. The service role is to use our legal authorities and policies to implement and support conservation, whether that's in the backseat helping other folks do their thing with TNC, USDA, state wildlife agencies, or directly through some of the actions that we can deliver for the species. So there's a diversity of tools and opportunities that exist. And in that, you guys will receive some resources either at the end of this or whatever. I encourage you to take that, look at it, learn from it, and come back and ask more questions, because the more we can get folks to understand those options, the better opportunity to find something that works for you in your situation. So one question that's come up several times in recent is that if Endangered Species Act was if a listing was to occur for the lesser prairie chicken, who does that apply to? And that applies to everybody, regardless of ownership, private landowners, government entity, everybody in the United States would have to abide by that. But that's also comes with a set of opportunities. And again, I'll point back to that resource that provides that as an opportunity, and continue to advocate that you engage with all of the other wonderful folks that are doing great work for grassland conservation in your local state, USDA programs, specifically FSA, Farm Services Agency, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the private lands programs that exist inside of the various other agencies and folks doing conservation. With that, I'm going to give kind of a general overview of the timeline for the lesser prairie chicken, so the folks kind of understand where we started and where we are now. So the story for the listing component of lesser prairie chicken dates back to October of 1995. That is the first time that the service was petitioned to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. In June of 1998, we did complete part of that petition process and made a warranted but precluded finding, meaning that at that point in time, we believe the species was warranted for listing under the Endangered Species Act, but that there were other higher priority resources ahead of it. Fast forward to December of 2012, this is when we officially proposed the species as threatened. April 2014, final listing rule, and the species was listed as threatened. Shortly following that final rule and that listing, there were several lawsuits filed. Some of those lawsuits were addressing issues that felt that we did not consider all of the conservation efforts that are ongoing for the species. And then there were some of the lawsuits that also felt that we didn't, that we should have listed the species as endangered, not as threatened. So through that process and those lawsuits, one of those eventually made it in front of the judge, and the final decision was made. The judge vacated the listing rule for the lesser prairie chicken in September of 2015. July of 2016, we ultimately then delisted the species officially, following the requirement of the judge from that lawsuit and the requirement to vacate. So 2 months later, September of 2016, we were petitioned again to list the species. So our current process and the date that folks have been hearing has been May 26th of 2021. Most likely, that you're hearing that because that's when we have reached a settlement agreement with the petitioners to deliver to the Federal Register on or before May 26th our final 12-month finding for that petition. Remind everybody that that is not a listing package at that point in time. It's just a determination of whether it's warranted or not warranted. Here in a bit, we'll talk about the specifics of those possible outcomes around that May 26th kind of timeline. But at this point, just know that that's kind of our general timeline. Chicken's got a long history in regards to litigation, petitions to list, and where we stand.
Thank you, Chris. Fantastic. We're getting a few questions. I got one in the chat here, and it may be difficult for us to get to all of them, but at the end, we'll have a question and answer period as well. And then you can get answers from the experts instead of me. So if you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or if you want to now, but we'll have a period for question and answer at the end. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to do a couple other things. Lesser prairie chickens are in trouble. Recovery is possible. And Tish, if you would spend a little time talking to us about how that might be achieved.
Once again, in 4 minutes, I get to tell you how we're going to make this work. And
What's the
so
problem?
some of mine are hard things to suggest and to say, and not always taken in the best way. In my opinion, though, education is the key. The majority of occupied range is privately owned, so one must work with those landowners. On a small scale, New Mexico Center of Excellence hired a local rancher as project manager in Milnesand. Landowners relate to him and respect his knowledge. Listen to your experienced local landowners and give them a leadership role. I believe all of the 5 states have folks that will fit this role. Resource managers that are short-term do not always fit that role without good mentorship. Betty will discuss other forms of education in her next, but she did a lot of that already too. So in order to recover the lesser range-wide, we must view lesser prairie chickens range-wide on a big scale in order to restore the range and not to reduce it. One must address the threats that I addressed earlier. Large strongholds of intact prairie are instrumental. First, fragmentation and degradation of habitat. Remember, fragmentation is that jigsaw puzzle thrown out on the table. Protect the sandy soils. There is no need to have wind development in sandy soils, as wind farms have both a vertical and horizontal negative footprint on the prairie chicken. In areas where wind farms are in or on the fringes of sandy soil, be sure quality CRP and/or grasslands are within and around the area. There needs to be no more energy development in the critical habitat assessment tool, Chat 1, that was developed by WAFWA with, I believe it was K-State or KU that developed the tool in accordance with
K-State.
WAFWA. Okay, thank you. They're all the same. I'm sorry, Kansas. So there should not be any energy development in Chat 1 or Chat 2. We cannot sustain further loss. The Nature Conservancy and Ply Lake Joint Venture both have siting guidelines for energy development that should be used by industry. Loss of habitat can be the consequence of unmanaged domestic livestock grazing. Grazing plans must be designed with the intention of creating diversity in plant composition and structure. Achieving this is a challenge in areas where ranchers already operate on a very slim profit margin, with little left over to devote to improving habitat for wildlife. That is why the government programs that Chris referenced and lucrative incentives could make a big difference by helping landowners with the resources they need to create a richer and more diverse habitat that could benefit all the species who live upon it. Providing incentives to prevent sod busting. Sod busting means converting native grassland into farmland, and preventing plowing up CRP when terms expire will keep habitat intact. The Farm Bill lowered annual CRP payments, which subsequently led to CRP acreage being actively converted back to farmland or poor grazing land. Lobby for adequate payments with native grasses. CRP in all of the ecoregions has been very beneficial to the lesser, in some areas better than others. It is crucial to keep this sandy soil in grass cover. Since grassland birds avoid vertical structure, it is important for the recovery of lessers to use brush control to remove mesquite and cedar juniper as it encroaches upon the sandy soil. This may be done via herbicide or grubbing. In herbicide treatments, the dead standing skeleton must be removed as it is still considered a vertical structure. These restoration efforts are expensive. So in determining restoration efforts in tight soil, consider whether it provides an appropriate corridor for the lesser. If tight soil is so far removed from the sandy soils, it will be a costly lost attempt at focusing only on the lesser. Drought has affected the small amounts of surface water in the southern region of the lesser prairie chicken. Heat is intensifying with climate change. Wildlife waters that are maintained year-long can provide a much-needed resource. Improved grazing management, good grassland, and acreage in CRP will help combat the effects of drought and climate variability, and this is backed by research. In writing agreements with industry or landowners, compliance must be met. Compromise has often come too easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Tish. Thank you very much for that. Very well done. Matt, this is, I suppose, an opportunity for a little bit of a commercial for the Nature Conservancy, which I'm not at all opposed to, by the way. So talk just a little bit about what TNC is doing to improve the future outlook for lesser prairie chickens.
Yeah, you bet, Rob. Let me see if I can get these slides to advance. Okay. So the Nature Conservancy is involved in a number of range-wide projects that help maintain or improve prairie chicken habitat. Wanted to just share a few examples of those projects. One of those is our Sight Wind Right tool. And I wanted to make sure I got this quote right from one of our lead scientists that developed this tool. He says that our studies suggest that up to 425 megawatts of wind could be developed in lesser prairie chicken states without impacting sensitive wildlife habitats, that is including lesser prairie chicken habitat. And that's roughly 4 times the installed wind capacity of the entire United States today. So what this tells me is that, for energy development, there's just no reason to, to cite any kind of energy development in high quality, intact lesser prairie chicken habitat, including wind. This is a tool that works, let's see, by basically a mapping tool that identifies locations of high priority wildlife habitat as places to avoid development. In doing so, it thereby identifies the inverse of that, which are low impact areas that are available for development. Another major effort from the Nature Conservancy that we've been working on for decades really is the development of lesser prairie chicken strongholds. Strongholds are areas, large areas on the order of 50,000 or so acres of permanently conserved high quality habitat. So when we look at the strongholds that the Nature Conservancy is attempting to develop throughout their range, starting to the north and moving south, in the shortgrass and CRP ecoregion, and thanks for defining CRP, by the way, Tish, always forget about that. The Conservancy has Smoky Valley Ranch and neighboring conservation easements comprising about 22,000 acres. Moving to the southwest in Sand Sage Prairie, in Hamilton County and neighboring eastern Colorado, the Conservancy holds about 35,000 acres of conservation easements. In the mixed grass prairie, we're working to develop about 50,000 acres currently of conservation easements in the Red Hills, and working in the landscape also around our Four Canyons Preserve. In the Shinnery Oak Prairie, the Conservancy co-owns and manages the 28,000 acre Millicent Prairie that Tish has been speaking and Betty have been speaking about. These strongholds have become important venues for scientific research, basically that has the potential, that aims to inform management and ensure that limited financial incentives, such as those available through things like the Farm Bill, are really efficiently targeted to address limiting factors of habitat. That's a really important role for these strongholds. We also demonstrate habitat management, practices that could be beneficial to lesser prairie chickens, like light to moderate stock restoration grazing, drought planning and implementation, low input year-long grazing, and as well as prescribed fire. And at one of these stronghold development areas, Smoky Valley Ranch, we've now gone from 17 males on 3 leks to 165 males on 13 leks this spring. The other thing that we do the Conservancy is very much focused on, Chris mentioned the value of partnerships, and we know that lesser chicken conservation requires a very large scale perspective, and no one can achieve this kind of scale alone. So we're using USDA Farm Bill and other voluntary conservation programs, and working with and supporting a large group of partners, including the most important partners in all of this, and that is ranchers. Because ranchers are the caretakers of over 95% of lesser prairie chicken habitat that's left. A couple examples of how we do this are by helping folks restore habitat through the Conservation Reserve Program, improve habitat through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and by helping landowners permanently conserve that habitat through conservation easements. I was also going to mention an urgent project that we've been focused on a lot lately. Tish mentioned that that last survey, almost 70% of the entire living population now resides in a relatively small area between the Arkansas River and I-70 in Kansas. And this is a population that's very much dependent upon CRP, so that as thousands of acres expire from that program, it's really important that landowners have sufficient incentives and a clear pathway to transition those CRP fields to grazing land instead of cropland. And I think that's all I've got here, Rob.
Very good, Matt. Thank you. We're about right on schedule here, and we're going to get to questions and answers in just a few minutes. But Chris, what's next? This is a pretty grueling saga of lesser prairie chickens with lots of ups and downs, and there's something big going on this month with respect to the lesser prairie chicken. Would you just kind of take us through what the outcomes of that might be?
Sure, Rob. Right now, we left off a bit ago with the May 26th, deliver the 12-month finding, which is basically a step in the process when we receive a petition, how we respond to that. So that's due to be delivered to the Federal Register on or before May 26th. So once that is published in the Federal Register, that becomes publicly available. Folks will be able to see the finding that comes out of that and the information that was used to support it. And so when it reaches the Federal Register, it can take anywhere from a couple of days to a couple of weeks for that to actually be published on their side. So be patient, but look for things around that time period. If people have questions, they can always reach out. So the outcome of that, and again, I want to emphasize, it's not a listing coming up in May. It's the finding from that 12-month, which will tell you whether it's warranted or not warranted. You have those two primary choices. So not warranted, if that's the finding, the bird will have no federal status. It means there's no federal regulatory controls from Fish and Wildlife Service. That is a final agency action. There won't be any public comment process on a not warranted finding, and that would be subject to litigation basically immediately. So with the first big branch, that's the not warranted. It's kind of the off ramp, goes back to state management authority. The second main branch is warranted, and then it has two kind of sub choices underneath that. It can be warranted but precluded, like it was back in 1998. At that point, it becomes a candidate species. Still has no federal regulatory control though. The candidate means that it gets reevaluated for listing basically on an annual basis. The species would benefit from those protections granted by the ESA, but it's currently precluded from moving through a listing rule because of other higher priority needs. So this is again another final agency action, no public comment, but subject to litigation immediately. The other option under warranted would be proposed as threatened or endangered. So with a proposed rule, the finding of warranted proposed and whatever status is proposed, that it would come with a 12 to 18 month timeline. So you have a draft rule that is open for public comment. Folks would be allowed, it's usually a 60-day comment period. We would solicit that input from landowners, agencies, anybody that's an interested party and has information to contribute to understanding the status of the bird. So that puts us on like a June through December of 2022 timeline with that 12 to 18 months. If that was to be the thing, that is an open encouragement to the public to engage in those comment opportunities that are provided and provide feedback to the service on anything that is relevant to the species, conservation efforts that are going on, known threats, those kinds of things. If listed, the implication of the listing landowner includes possible restrictions on the taking of the species without a permit or authorization. But the resource that you're going to be provided, it's a link to a kind of a 2-page document laid out in a grid, real basic language. It talks about different options there, different opportunities. Some of those are pure conservation opportunities, and some of those are just a permit to cover your actions. You have things that are conservation banking, opportunities for landowners to engage in monetary opportunities to benefit themselves and the species. So there's a host of options that become available, including additional funding mechanisms if the species is proposed. So the biggest question we get is, okay, what's the finding going to be? Well, I can't tell you because I don't actually know. The package has been sent up to our headquarters and is in discussion with headquarters and Department of Interior. Management will make that final decision, and a finding will be published. So folks just need to wait and see what that's going to be, on around that May 26th timeline. And I think, Rob, I'll stop there and leave time for more questions we can fill in. I've seen some good ones come up on the side. And so I think I'm done there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Excellent overview of a complex process. We're getting close to the end of our time here. And I just want to say that there are some questions both in the question box and in the chat. And Laura, you might help direct those to Betty, Chris, Matt, and Tish. But I just want to say that anyone who is interested in learning more about the lesser prairie chicken biology, its legal status, its history, where to go see them, I'd suggest that you get on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. Check out the Prairie Grouse Technical Council if you want to know some scientific background and history on them. The North American Grouse Partnership website at www.grousepartners.org is also a good place to go learn about lesser prairie chickens. If you Google Kansas State University lesser prairie chickens, you'll come up with a body of mind-numbing scientific peer-reviewed literature there as well. Matt, Chris, any of the rest of you have suggestions for where people can go to learn more, and then we'll get to questions for a few minutes.
I just say reach out to your local folks. If you need help finding a local contact, I'm glad to help direct you to. I know there's lots of other folks as well. And so, look for those, a diversity of opinions on what's going on there and see where those opportunities exist.
And I strongly recommend the book, Ecology and Conservation of Lesser Prairie Chickens, edited by Dave Focus and Clint Bolt.
Thank you. Any other suggestions? Well, let's get to the questions and answers. I'll just touch on some of the questions that are in the chat here. Some of them I've tried to field as they came across the transom, but I was soon swamped. There are a couple of questions about who do we get involved with, and the short answer is the North American Grouse Partnership, the Nature Conservancy. Many local organizations are working to conserve lesser prairie chickens. Supporting those organizations' work is critically important to the survival of this species. Anybody want to add anything to that? All right, we'll jump right in here. I'll skip down to a question here.
So Rob, while you're doing that, I'll just, my 2 cents are, from the services perspective, and I'll speak largely from my own here, is that anything that anybody that's doing things that is avoiding loss of prairie and grasslands, conservation easements are a tool. They don't work for everybody. Some folks that are a positive thing. Look at those and see if they fit. There's different programs with different obligations and opportunities. Any kind of grassland restoration and protection. Tish touched on the large blocks of grassland, and Matt emphasized the scale component. It is going to take kind of a complexing of programs, right? And putting those together on the landscape where they all piece together into a bigger benefit. Those are the kinds of things we're interested in. Removing woody plant encroachment. Those are all things that are in line with with management that benefit producers. The ranching community need that as well as the grassland obligate species. And so it doesn't really matter what the program and the opportunity is, but if there's one that for you, I encourage folks to engage in that, and glad to talk about the different opportunities that exist.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Chris.
as far as habitat management type opportunities, you know, the USDA Farm Bill has the vast majority of resources that are available. So if a person's interested in those sort of programs, you know, stopping by at the local NRCS and FSA Service Center is a good place. In Kansas, we've got an excellent crew with NRCS, an excellent crew with our state wildlife agency, the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks Tourism. They've got biologists scattered throughout the Lesser Prairie-Chicken range. And I think within, you know, for most states, that's the case. So they're also a tremendous resource as far as boots on the ground in Lesser Prairie-Chicken habitat. And of course, the Nature Conservancy does have a number of programs and options available for folks who are interested. You know, I talked a lot about strongholds, and you know, the reality is that you know, the voluntary conservation programs that comprise these strongholds and that get toward these strongholds, like conservation easements, you know, we feel like have to be the foundation of a strategy for long-term recovery and certainty for this bird. And so that's a program that we focus a lot on. It's a really important tool.
Rob,
There's a question. Go ahead, Laura.
I would say there's a question here I think you're well suited to answer. Someone asked about the role that sports people, hunters and fishermen and sports people can play, and how they might engage through those types of groups with the nonprofit organizations and government agencies behind so much of the conservation efforts we've already mentioned.
Well, I would just say this. I started to type this answer into the chat. Conserving a wide ranging species like lesser prairie chicken is, I don't think it's an overstatement to say it's excruciatingly expensive. And I'd say it's worth it. You're relying on private lands to be set aside, sometimes in perpetuity, managed differently, sometimes in perpetuity. And that's what this, you know, this species needs: large swaths of well-managed private lands. Most of the time, private lands that someone's trying to make a living off of. And those private landowners have to be compensated for changes in how they manage, and it's expensive. So I would say support organizations that are involved in conservation, support the implementation of Farm Bill conservation programs that Matt mentioned, and work with local landowners. There are both commercial and private and government interests involved in protecting lesser prairie chicken habitat, and getting involved with one of those, supporting them financially or with your expertise, your time, talent, and treasure is the best way to go.
I've got a quick one that I want to address. Sorry, I misspoke, or I mistyped that. Dang it, that's why I had a quote and I still goofed it up. It should be gigawatts, 425 gigawatts, not megawatts of wind capacity. And there's actually over 1,000 gigawatts of low impact wind in the 17 state region, you know, in the Great Plains here. So, but yeah, thanks for calling that out in the chat there. That should be 425 gigawatts.
We've got a few other questions in the chat here. Somebody asked here, Chris, you might be the best one to ask, what is the relationship between oil producers and litigation against creating an endangered status, the lesser prairie chicken?
So right now, there's no pending litigation. You know, there's no federal action for them to litigate on. So depending on the outcome of the 12-month finding, and how folks feel about that, we may receive it. The history has shown that there's a fairly contentious concerns from industry side and landowner sides and the conservation community side about the status of the bird and how it should be treated under the ESA. So the service tries to work with all of those folks. We have kind of a wide range of different tools and different approaches. Some of those work for some folks, some of them don't. That's why I'm a big advocate for telling folks to reach out, have those conversations. There's no commitment in it. There's no obligation to it. You learn more, you can walk away and find something that works for you. Some of those are existing conservation approaches. Some of those that are in development now. And if none of those work for you, there's the possibility of developing them for individual entities or programmatically, for industry-wide type approaches. So, part of that is there's got to be some initiative and interest to know what those options are. And that's what my role and all of the other conservation folks in the local area are for. They're able to provide that technical input on what's the opportunity, and we can find a regulatory tool to make that work. Some of that's before it's listed, some of that's after it's listed. So there are opportunities on both sides of the coin there.
Sorry. Thank you, Chris. There's a couple of questions that I'll take real quickly because they're easy ones. I take the easy ones. And we're just about out of time here. Someone asked, has captive breeding ever been attempted by prairie chickens? The Sutton Research Institute in Northeast Oklahoma, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but they have been authorized to attempt captive breeding with lesser prairie chickens. I don't know if they've actually started that yet, but they have a charge to do that. Is that?
So Atwaters and graders they've been working with. I'm not aware of lesser work yet to date.
They haven't started.
So, but it's just not in my wheelhouse at this point.
Yeah. But prairie chickens in general have been propagated in captivity. Someone also asked if prairie seeds come through CRP, and it depends on what state you're in, what kind of seed you get. In Kansas, almost all the CRP was done in some sort of native grass mix. In Oklahoma, much of it was not. I'm not sure about New Mexico, but landowners can get native grass seeds in the CRP program, and it's been really helpful to lesser prairie chickens where that's been done.
Originally in CRP in New Mexico, it was non-native grasses, but now to have it continue to be in CRP has to be at least 51% native grasses. So yes, there are seed companies in New Mexico and West Texas that fill that order.
Got time for just a couple other questions here. Someone asked about Native American tribal lands, reservations in the U.S. and their role in prairie chicken conservation. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe one of you does. They don't come into play in Kansas in lesser prairie chicken range, I know.
So from Fish and Wildlife Service, when we reach out for any kind of federal action that's going to go on through us, we typically communicate with the tribes. We have an obligation to communicate with the tribes as independent nations here in the U.S. And so some of those folks we reach out to have a history, a historical context for the range of the lesser prairie chicken and prairie chickens in general. But in terms of reservations or owned lands, substantial owned lands, it's pretty limited in the current range for lessers. There's a lot of historical use there, but most of those tribes have been moved to reservations or other locations and no longer own land inside the range.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we're a couple minutes past time here, Laura, and I just thank you to Betty, to Tish, to Chris, and to Matt. And Laura, once again, thanks to you for herding all these cats. Really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's participated this evening. If we didn't get to your question, please reach out to us at the Nature Conservancy's social media site, and we'll figure out a way to get you an answer.
before everyone goes, if you have just a few minutes to stay on, I think we'd like to give Betty the last word here. And just
Thank you, Laura.
share some of your thoughts, as a landowner in an area where there should be lesser prairie chickens, what's your perspective of what recovery might mean and what ensuring habitat for this species means to you? Oh, you're still muted.
You're
I'm
muted.
muted. I'm sorry. I can't see anybody, so I hope you can still see and hear me. I'm way out in the country on terrible internet, so doing my best out here. My father came here as a toddler in 1915. He used to talk about riding horseback for miles to help neighbors in this country, and how in the dawns of spring, that entire ride was a stereo concert of prairie chickens, drumming and cackling in every direction. I'll be 60 this year. In my childhood, we could reliably hear Lex in 5 directions from our home. The one to our southeast, one far to the east, one to the northeast, one to the southwest, and one far to the west. Our visitors watched dozens of dancing chickens as the sun rose. I remember seeing hundreds soaring into milo fields a few miles from here in the fall. The Leks are much fewer and farther between now. We rejoice if we ever see double numbers on a Lek. One spring, during a stretch of years as dry as this one, we were met with only silence. It's heartbreaking to watch a species struggling for its very existence. We all know that recovery involves rain, but it also involves thoughtful consideration of species besides our own. The last remaining viable territory for the lesser prairie chicken occupies a much too small spot on the map. I know I have neighbors who have never seen these shy and reclusive birds, and I know I have neighbors who consider them more of a nuisance than a blessing. But here's the thing. Good lesser prairie chicken habitat is good for cattle and humans and a host of other species. It's not an either-or situation. On our place, helping maintain that habitat meant taking a locally unpopular stand against a giant wind turbine project that would have put those 262-foot tall towers just across our north fence. Talk about vertical structures. Thanks to the effort of some dedicated individuals, that boundary was pushed back a few critical miles to help maintain some of the last best unfragmented territory in our area. Maintaining habitat also meant, for us at least, making the difficult decision, driven by years of drought, to completely sell our cattle herd last October, before the native vegetation was eaten beyond recovery. It also meant keeping wildlife waters and stock tanks in working order to make sure that our birds and other wildlife have access to them. And so they'll still be usable for a future herd down the road, not if it rains, but when it rains. I am famous for my unwarranted optimism. There is no record in my family of my homesteading grandparents being saved from starvation by the vast numbers of lesser prairie chickens that historically blackened the skies. We never sold hunting rights back in the day when that season still happened. Our early morning tours and the breakfasts that followed were never offered for a price. Ours is merely a relationship based on love and respect and admiration for a bird that was here long before we were, and one that is struggling to keep a fragile claw hold in its ever-shrinking habitat. These iconic birds are as much a part of the tapestry of our world as the shinri oak and the sand and the endless skies and the little blue stem. I just hope somehow, some way, we can find room for our shy, feathered neighbors to continue the song they have sung here since time began, the song that means another spring has arrived. What does habitat and recovery mean to me? It means walking out at sunrise on a pearly April morning and hearing Lex in 5 directions.
Thank you, Betty. Rob, you're muted.
I have nothing to add to that, Betty. That was wonderful. I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't get to tonight. Please reach out to us and we'll try to get you answers. And long live the lesser prairie chicken. Thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.